Hi guys, so I just wanted to create this video for the post lab for the determining the equilibrium constant lab that you guys did. So in this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rubric and what is expected, and then I'm going to go through the calculations for you. I'm not going to do the calculations, I'm just going to talk through each one so you know what to expect and how to do those calculations. So if you take a look at the rubric, you're going to notice that you still are receiving points for formatting. So that means up at the top on the first page of your lab, make sure you're putting your name, your lab partner's name, the title, the date, and then at the bottom of every page you turn in, you need to make sure you sign and date it. Because if you don't sign and date, you're not going to get all of the points for formatting. If you mess up, use just one line. The biggest thing with this, now that we're starting to get more and more data tables, please use a ruler to make your data tables. Make them look neat. When you have multiple data tables, you want to make sure that it's neat. So use a ruler. So whether you need to use one of my rulers or you have a ruler of your own, please just use a ruler to create your data tables. So now with this lab itself, you should have the pre-lab already completed. So when you have the pre-lab, let me scroll up to the top of this lab, you have all of this background information. This background information will be useful. So make sure that you read through it. If you haven't read through it yet, just go back, read through it. Notice you have the objective. So now that you've done the lab, you also have an idea as to what you need to do. And then you have your pre-lab questions. So your pre-lab questions, for the most part, will come from the background information. Beer's Law, you've done once before when we did the Beer's Law lab. So if you want to look back at that pre-lab, you can. But then as you go through these pre-lab questions, you just want to make sure that you use the background information in the lab. That way you're getting all of the information that you need. For the procedure, remember you're paraphrasing, so you're just going to go through and paraphrase the procedure. This data table I will talk a little bit about when we get to calculations. It does not need to be in your procedure. So then the rest of your procedure, again, you're just paraphrasing. You do not need to write this word for word. So once you have your pre-lab, right, purpose, procedure, pre-lab questions, then you go to data and observations. Notice in the lab I put what you needed for data and observations. So this data table is what you need. Remember that your data table needs to have a title and a number. So this should be data table 1, absorbance values. Right, that works. So this you want to make sure in your lab notebook you label it data table 1, absorbance values. And then notice I also told you need some qualitative observations. So what did the solutions look like before? What did it look like when you mix them together? Things like that. Those are qualitative. And so that's going to be your data and observations. That's all you need. And then you needed the temperature. Now, the big part of this lab are the calculations. So notice I gave you a little reminder that you need to show and label calculations for just one trial. Now you have two ways of setting up your calculations. You can work through one calculation. So in the lab itself, right, the calculations page, I might as well just scroll through. The calculations page, you need to show one of each of these and make sure that you label it. So for example, number 2, you could label it initial concentration of Fe3+. Number 3, initial concentration of SCN-, and so on. And then you're going to put your answers inside this results table. This table, this entire table, goes in your calculations section. Because it's a data table, it needs a label and a title. So you could label this data table 2 results table. That's fine. Now, two ways that you can set this up. You can work through a calculation in its own section, right, in the calculation section, and then just put the answer in the table, or you can actually draw this table in your lab notebook and leave extra space in trial 1 and show the work in the box. Either way, however you do it, you need to make sure that I can clearly see your work. If you show work in the table, then off to the side, just make sure you number everything. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then just make sure you show the work for averaging the values. But then in the calculation section, it explains each calculation individually. I'll go over that in 1 second, but at the end of the lab, make sure that you write out your conclusion. So purpose, did you fulfill it, why or why not? You don't need sources of error unless you feel like you had a major source of error. Really, all I need is purpose, was it fulfilled, why or why not? So if we go back to the calculations section, what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of the calculations, and I'm going to specifically show you in the lab where it gives you essentially all of the information that you need. Okay, so in the calculations section, each calculation is numbered, but what I did in my copy is I actually went through and I boxed all of the important equations that they gave us. And I'm just going to briefly talk through each calculation so that you know what values you're using and where to find them. So remember, in your lab notebook, you need to make sure that your calculations table match these calculations. So what I mean by that is in your calculations, like number 1 says to write the KC expression. Well, look in the background information and in the pre-lab, you wrote this expression already. So look at where you have all of the information, which is the background information, and then you can go through and you can write your KC expression. KC means concentration. So what you can do in this table is next to this, just put number 1, because then that will match your calculations. So then number 2 tells you that you're calculating the initial concentration of Fe3+. So if you are showing the work in the table, then over here write number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and so on, and then show your work in these boxes. If you are not showing your work in the table, then what you need to do in your lab notebook is label it initial concentration Fe3+, and then show your work. So notice that I told you in here that you can calculate this initial concentration using this equation. I gave you the equation already. And right underneath, it even says this should be the same for all 4 test tubes. So to get these numbers, so the iron 3 nitrate and the total volume, you're looking back at the procedure. So when you're looking back at the procedure, you had different amounts that you were using based on this table in step 5. And so for test tube 1, notice that each of the 4 test tubes had 5 milliliters of iron 3 nitrate, and then the total volume when you add all of them up is always 10. So for calculation 2, you should have the same value for all 4 test tubes. Calculation 3 tells you to calculate the initial concentration of SCN minus. So you're going to do the same thing. You're going to do KSCN, so your volume that you used from that table, divided by the total volume, which should be 10 milliliters. And then you're multiplying by 0.002, because that is the concentration of KSCN. I even gave you how to do it right here, right, for test tube 1. So there's your sample calculation that you need, right? In test tube 1, you had 2 milliliters of KSCN, 10 milliliters total. If we wanted to look at the next test tube 2, you had 3 milliliters in 10 milliliters total, then 4, then 5. So here are the equations that you're going to be using. Now when you get to calculation 4, this is where you're going to have to start using the absorbance values that you got in the lab. So if you notice, this is the equation you're going to be using, and it tells you that AEQ is the equilibrium absorbance value and ASTD is standard. So when you are looking at your data table, these absorbance values that you collected, those are your equilibrium absorbance values, and here's your absorbance of your standard. So that's what you're going to be using in this. And then it even gives you the concentration of the standard right here. So you're just going to take trial 1 divided by the standard times 0.0002. Trial 2's absorbance divided by the standard times 0.0002. Remember, I just need to see work for one of them. And then calculation 5 and 6 give you the equations that you need. So you're going to take the initial that you calculated up here in number 2 minus the equilibrium. And the equilibrium is what you calculated in number 4. So you're going to essentially take number 2 minus number 4 for each trial. And then you're going to do the same thing for the SCN minus at equilibrium. Take the initial from number 3, calculate it up here, minus the equilibrium that we calculated in number 4. So you'll take number 3 minus number 4 for each trial. And then once you have all of the equilibrium values, if you think about what you have now, you have all 3 of the equilibrium values. So to calculate Kc, you're going to look up here at your K expression, plug in your equilibrium concentrations. That'll let you solve for Kc. I just need to see it one time. And then finally, calculation 8, you're just averaging your values of Kc. Make sure you answer this last part of the question though. How constant were your values? So show me how you averaged them. The average will go here at whatever temperature you were working with in your data table, and then answer this question at the end. So if you notice along the side, each calculation has a number. If you're showing it in your lab notebook, number your calculations and label them. If you're showing it in your data table, then just number the row that corresponds with that calculation.